This is a film about a trip to Japan, and it commenced in Dubbo with Balfour Beres Dohnt, Arthur and Rita Cullen, and Alan and Pat Bryant heading off from Dubbo to go to Japan to join the Tanashi City Rotarians. But before we left, Balfour Beres Dohnt stayed in Sydney for a day or two, and to kill time we thought we'd go around and take some pictures of our very beautiful harbour, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and of course the Opera House. It was a beautiful fine day, and as you can see, Sydney Harbour is truly a beautiful spot. The idea was that the group go to Tanashi in Tokyo, where we'd be met by the Tanashi City Rotarians and home hosted for a whole week. And the rest of the film that you will see will be about just that, where we're being home hosted and that style of thing by the Japanese Rotarians. The music that will be supplied in the background in the near future was played by Mr. Kawachi, who was a Rotarian who visited Dubbo last year and brought with him his portable electronic organ. And we're about now to cross to Japan. The scene that you see here is looking from Balfour Beres's bedroom window at the Arai family, and it's looking out onto the garden into just outside our own bedroom. You can see there Mr. Arai, who was the visitor to Dubbo last year, and his wife in their own garden. There's a lovely garden with very typical type Japanese bushes and shrubs and that style of thing. When I first woke each morning and slid back the bamboo and paper shutter, that was the sight that I had right across level from our bedroom. Our bedroom is the one that's facing there where Beres is pointing just now, and they're going to open the shutters for you so you can sort of see exactly what we saw from our bedroom. It was a lovely two-storey home, a very typical Japanese home, and beautifully fitted out right through. The walls were, or this particular wall here was a glass sliding door, then there were sliding fixed panels, and then on the inside of that was paper. One of our first day visits with the Tanashi Rotary Club was to go to the local Buddhist Temple. And here you see Alan Bryant and Rita and Arthur Cullen and the rest of the group wandering off around the shrine and the temple. It's just a scene through the gates of the temple down into the temple itself. One of the things that happened at the temple was that one of the Rotarians, who was the priest, made a special occasion and had a special service for us in the temple. And there you can see him on the right. He's a Rotarian. He's a married man with 2 children, which I didn't know that the Buddhists did. And we were being entertained at the moment in the courtyard of the temple with the small cups of Japanese green tea. Immediately after this, we were then taken in and given an official Japanese tea ceremony, which was beautifully carried out. The little shrine that the special service that was held for us is viewed right there. This particular scene is just an average out-of-town scene in the suburb of Shinjuku in Tokyo. It's not a particular street picked out, it's just one of the very narrow, very many streets in Shinjuku or the immediate area that are narrow. Every street is dotted with cherry blossom, and this is just the scene as the Bryants, the Cullens and the Don'ts arrived at the side of the shrine. The photograph or scene there of Beres taking some pictures of the cherry blossom, and the next thing you'll see is the Bryants wandering around underneath the cherry blossom. The Tanashi Rotary Club members, very late one afternoon, took us for a walk down one of the very large Shinjuku local parks. There were many trees being erected in the park. They lift them up holus bolus, set them up and tripod them and wrap them up so they won't be damaged. And this particular scene here is you see Dr. Sashida and one or two of the other Tanashi Rotarians, Pat Bryant, Beres Dohnt and one of the Rotarians' wives, wandering along in and around the cherry blossom. The Japanese have something about the cherry blossom, in as much that cherry blossom season, which is very early in April, the Japanese all come out and they have themselves set up with barbecues and all that sort of thing in, under and around all the cherry blossoms. The particular scene taken at the moment was taken just on dark. It was, in actual fact, I was using a night film, and in fact you can see the street lights are already on, and in a moment you'll see these other lights here that you see there now are also on. You can just see some of the Japanese arriving in groups sitting around underneath the trees. Whilst we're in Japan,
hooray for me!
The local Rotary Club put on a birthday party for Beres, as it just so happened to be her 50th birthday. There you see Alan and Pat Bryant, Beres and the cake. We didn't know that the party was being put on until we arrived home, and we saw somebody wandering in with cakes, chili prawns, bottles of local steam and all that sort of thing, and wondered what it was all about. And of course we didn't have to wait very long to find out that it was the occasion of Beres's 50th birthday. There you see Beres blowing out the candles for her 50th birthday. Just a scene of some of the Rotarians that came to the party that night. They were great company. Even though we had a language problem, I can assure you that the whole troop did not stop laughing and giggling practically the whole night. There you see Beres and Pat just been examining something, their attention's been caught, and in the background Alan Bryant there, you can see him. I think he's describing something a fish he may have caught or something rather like that sometime or other. The local Japanese. One of the things that the Japanese Rotary Club did for us was they took us on a 2-day bus tour to the mountain resort of Nico. And on the way, the coach stopped just a few miles out of Tokyo, and the houses you see there are just very typical local Japanese houses with their own little gardens, the bedding hanging out over the rail being aired, and each one of them in Japan tries to have his own little particular house and own particular little garden. I imagine that the Japanese would have all been in high-rises. Not so. Majority of them live in their own small houses. Just another scene, we were crossing over a river and there was a golf course on both sides of the river. There was a punt that went from one side to the other side very regularly for the long hitters or the long strokers, whatever it might be. And I can assure you it was a very beautiful golf course, and I believe that it's a very expensive hobby in Japan. There you see one of the caddies. Driver training ranges are very popular in Japan. The learners are not permitted out in the road until they've done something like 15 hours of driver training on the driver training range that you see there, which is probably 4 acres. This is taken inside the coach. You see Rita Cullen up front there, and this is the coach that we were taken to Nico. A second-hand car yard. There was just some of the advertising signs on the side of it. And this is one of the highways, or the highway going through one of the suburbs of Japan, heading up towards Nico. We're now well out in the open roads, and you can see the beautiful highway that we're on. The Japanese drive on the same side of the road as we do, and I can assure you that the roads were particularly good. You can see far in the distance the snow-capped mountains, and that was the general area that we were heading for. Bit bumpy every now and then, but one of those things. In Japan, at a certain time of each year, which happens to be this April, the Japanese have something about the boys. And for each boy in the family, they hang on a pole a rather large kite sort of carp fish. If there's a new son born in the family, the flags go up, or the carp go up for each one, and one for the new one. And here you see the Bryant's, Cullens and so on just coming back down from a restaurant where the Japanese had just fated us to lunch. At the moment we're just waiting to get back on the little coach. You see our driver there cleaning the windscreen, and that was the particular little coach which was air conditioned. It was fitted with television, it had its bar, it had its freezer. It was basically a self-contained vehicle. We've now arrived in Nico National Park, which is a very, very famous landmark in Japan. In Nico there are huge cedar trees. Some of these trees are 600 and 700 years of age. I can assure you they're very tall trees, and if you suffer from hay fever or sinus and that sort of thing, stay away, because I can assure you that you will finish up with a lot of sneezes. It's just one of the avenues around the temples and the shrines. You see the little interpreter there. That particular little girl came to Australia, or was in Australia last year, when the Tanashi Rotary Club members visited our club, and she interpreted for them and for us. There you see Beres and young Sanai discussing something, Dr. Sashida. The shrine, or the temple that you see there, pagoda or whatever else you want to call it, I tried to film it some 28 years ago, didn't have a lot of results. I've tried to film it again this year, and I still didn't have a lot of result. It's one of those very, very hard things to photograph. This particular area was all a mass of shrines and temples and that sort of thing of the Buddhist religion. It's not snow in the foreground, it's rocks. We were taken in and out of many of the buildings or the shrines and that sort of thing, and had the purpose explained to us as to what they were for. Just a scene of some of the ornate carvings and that sort of thing tucked in underneath the eaves of the temples and shrines. This scene was taken from our hotel bedroom window, looking out over just some of the houses around Nico Township. It's only a small town, probably a total population of 20,000 people, and would have an annual visitors of some millions, because Nico is a very famous spot. You can see the mountains also in the background, the snow-covered mountains. The scenes that you just saw was a party that was put on by the Japanese Rotarians at the hotel we stayed at overnight. Each one of us had to sing, and I won't say any more about that. The next day they took us higher up into the mountains, and you can see in the distance there the road winding up the side of the mountains. It's not Fuji, it's a long way away from Fuji. And you can see there the snow-capped mountains, and we'll now zoom up onto the road itself, so you can just get a bit of an idea of the size and magnitude of the road. There you see Rita and Alan Bryant, Arthur and Alan Bryant just discussing something. In the distance you can see Beres and Rita looking out over the mountainside. Another couple of weeks and the whole mountainside would have been very green, because it was just the tail end of winter. Spring was just coming and the trees were all just starting to sprout little green shoots ready for springtime. The gang just climbed back onto the coach, and we're now ready to head off up that windy road that you just saw a moment ago. There were something like 48 bends in just a few miles of road travelling. Once we arrived up further up the mountains, we came across this waterfall, or stretch of water running down a lot of rocks. I just forget what you would call it. Cascades. There was cherry blossom trees, and all the trees were just starting to come out in their greenery. Another view of another family that had probably 4 or 5 boys. Let me see, yeah, 4 boys there by the look of it, by the number of carp. The cascades that you just saw was known as the Ryuzu Cascades. And there is another picture of it taken just a little bit further up. I can assure you that it's very beautiful, and I can assure you also it was quite cold, because there was still a lot of snow and ice in this immediate area. It's just a scene there of the cascades going down and the ice formed under some of the logs and that sort of thing. Japan is truly a very beautiful place. Most people sort of think of Japan as industry and smog, but you don't have to go very, very far out of the Tokyo centre before you do come across some very beautiful scenery. One of the lakes up in the mountains, in actual fact, many, many years ago, I had rowed on that particular lake, of which we had some film taken, and we still have it some 28, 29 years of age now. Just another scene of the cascades with the iced up bits of wood and that sort of thing there caught in the stream. We went a little bit further up the mountains again, and here you see some of the snowfields. They're basically not polluted in any way, apart from an odd beer can or whatever else it might be. It was truly a beautiful sight, and I think had we have been there some weeks before, there would have been a lot more snow. As I say, it was the tail end of winter and spring was just coming on. There's just another scene of our coach there again in the parking yard in the snow. Just some scenes in the or next to the car park, and that particular one caught my eye, and it reminded me so much of a kiwi. Looks like he's got a case of the drips. The gentleman was just nearby, and he was selling freshly cooked, fresh caught trout. Actually, I was very tempted. The little sign you see there is scattered around everywhere, and it's just a note to make everybody keep the place clean. Just a couple of cans in the snow. And another formation in the snow which reminded me of a polar bear. This is just another scene again taken from the car park, and it's just a general mountain scene, and as I said earlier, another few weeks and all the trees would have been out in all their greenery. The lake again, as you see there, and this was originally a volcano, and it's the same lake as you saw earlier in the film that I mentioned that I had rowed around on some 28, 29 years ago. It's a very beautiful spot, it's a very famous spot, and it's visited by many millions of Japanese. The waterfall you see there is a rather large waterfall, and even with the wide-angle lens I was not able to fit all of it in. Just some water trickling out of the side of the mountain, which would then run on down to the river far below. This is just about the tail end of our tour of Nico, and it was just a sign, don't ask me what it says, and immediately now we will join the bus and return to Tokyo. The gentleman you see there is a mechanical man, and there's another one there, and they are there to control the traffic. Program you've seen for the last few minutes was part of a display put on by the Tanashi Rotarians as a part of the farewell party to the brides, the Cullens and the Don'ts. The sound that you've heard was original and recorded right at the scene. And just before we depart, this is just some film taken of the lights at Shinjuku. And just a reminder that the music you've heard has been played by Mr. Kawachi on his portable organ, and he was one of the Rotarians who visited Dubbo last year. Well, it's just about the tail end of it. All I can say is great, great, great. This is a film taken in April of 1981 by Balfour Beres Dohnt during a Qantas jetabout tour of Japan and the Orient, which included Taiwan, Hong Kong and a tour to China. One of the first things you do when you arrive at your hotel, I suppose, is take a look out the window. And this is just one of the scenes, or one of the many scenes, taken from our hotel window. The roadway goes straight down to the Shinjuku railway station, and Shinjuku is one of the inner big suburbs of Tokyo. It's probably a little bit like Parramatta, a bit out of Sydney, if that's the kind of thing you're thinking. And this is just a general scene taken from our window, looking out over the department stores, factories, and all of the smaller little business houses tucked in between. Shinjuku is a very large shopping centre, and there are millions and millions of people go there shopping. The big tower in the distance, or the big building in the distance, I don't know what it is, but it's a very prominent looking building anyway. And this is taken from our hotel in Shinjuku. One of the first things we do on these tours is to go and take a look from Tokyo Tower. And Tokyo Tower is basically a bit of a copy of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And it's used by all the telecommunication people, the television people, and so on. And you do get a very, very good look out over Tokyo itself. And there you see young Beres from Dubbo taking a bit of a look through the telescope over Tokyo. In the distance you can see the Emperor's Palace, which is tucked in behind that rather large building. And this again is just some more of the buildings in and around the inner area of Tokyo. Big buildings, little buildings, trees intermingled. I'd heard terrible stories about the traffic in Tokyo. I can assure you it's no worse than the traffic in Dubbo, and nowhere near as bad as the traffic in Sydney. Just panning up so I can get a look at the highways, the buildings, and we zoom up now onto a cherry blossom tree right near the inner area of Tokyo. And I can assure you, cherry blossom trees are scattered from one end of Japan to the other. There in the distance you'll see Tokyo again with highways, and in this particular case, where the two highways join, I think there are 3 decks of traffic. Tokyo does have highways which crisscross over Tokyo, and you don't have any problem getting from one side of it to the other side in a very few minutes, provided you know where you're going. Whereas in Sydney you've got traffic lights every 50 yards basically, and you're held up. This is just a scene in the Shinjuku shopping area and business area. On this particular day we pay a visit to the Emperor's Palace and the Emperor's Palace Gardens, and this is just some of the group on the Qantas Jetabout tour. We've just arrived at the gardens of the Emperor's Palace, and we now go for a wander for a couple of hours through the Emperor's Palace Gardens. The hedges as you see there are azaleas, and I would say that in another 3 or 4 weeks' time they would have been a very, very beautiful and very different coloured picture to what you see now, because they were all in bud. I got the impression that the hedges, or the azalea hedges, were trimmed by machine to keep them in shape. A Japanese tea house in the background there was the Japanese tea house for the Emperor when he goes to the tea ceremonies, which is about once per week. Just still some of the gardens in the Emperor's Palace Gardens. You're quite free to wander. You are being watched, I can assure you, the whole time to make sure you don't wander off in the wrong direction. But it certainly was a very beautiful garden, and a lot of time and a lot of money has been spent to keep it as it is just now. And as I said a moment ago, in another 3 or 4 weeks it would have been a much different picture to what it is now. There you see cherry blossom trees, and another few days the cherry blossoms would have finished, and the azalea bushes would then start and come out. It's just part of the group of Australians. Oh, I wonder what that smells like. Cherry blossoms, you'll notice there are 2 different shades of cherry blossom. The deeper pink that you see there is more the wild cherry blossom, and the paler one is the cultured cherry blossom. As I said a moment ago, there was cherry blossom from one end of Japan to the other end in this particular time of the year. A week or 2 either way, and you would see very, very little. It's just part of the buildings of the Emperor's Palace, with some of the taller buildings, business buildings in the background, of the inner suburb of Tokyo. This is some of the group filing back out and checking out of the Empress Palace Gardens, and there you see Beres and Pat wandering through the gates which take them back to our coach to take us on again. There again you see the moat and part of the Empress Palace buildings, and the main gateway of that particular side of the palace anyway, leading into the gardens. This particular scene was just taken in another bunch of gardens in the inner suburbs of Tokyo again, around near the Ginza. And on this particular occasion it was a Sunday, and a lot of Japanese families were in there just wandering, looking, and just thoroughly enjoying the sights in this particular garden. Cherry blossom again, little lakes, beautiful trees, and beautiful flowers to be seen everywhere. This is our second tour, or second trip to Nico. The first was with the Japanese Rotarians, and there again is the pagoda at Nico. It was a very wet, miserable day, and we did still manage to get some very, very good pictures. And I dare say there's probably just about as many umbrellas there as there are people. This particular scene was taken one night when we were heading off to a nightclub, and it was just no particular scene. It was just general street scenes in the suburbs of Tokyo. The neon signs in Tokyo have a lot more movement in them than a lot of other neon signs I've seen in different other parts of the world. And as I say, it was just any old night scene on our way to a nightclub. The scene that you see here and the next particular one weren't at the nightclub, and unfortunately they're not real. This was some of the scenes that were taken during our visit to the nightclub in Tokyo. The girls were majority were topless, and the music was pretty loud and pretty raucousy, and most of the people downstairs were all Japanese businessmen, and the majority of them had escorts. Just another highlight of the particular nightclub was there was two girls, I can only show you one, came out in carry baskets, and they were suspended from the ceiling, and they were probably around about 30 feet from the ground, and of course they came right over near us. Once the girls backtracked back to their little closets and that sort of thing, the show went on. And it was a pretty lively and pretty bright sort of a show, and it went for around about an hour and a half. From there we headed off on a tour of Japan, and one of the first places they took us to was the Kotakuro Monastery in Kamakura. Kamakura was a very famous place during World War II. Kamakura is not far from Tokyo, and it's the place of the big bronze Buddha. The majority of the bronze for this particular thing, or Buddha I should say, was brought by Japanese pirates from China, and what they actually did was they brought coins, copper, brass and that sort of thing back from China some centuries ago, melted it down and built this fabulous Buddha. And there he has stood for so long. And if you can see the way he's got his hands particularly folded, it's a very unusual pose, and I believe it's the way that Buddha used to sit. The particular monastery and Buddha here is visited daily by many thousands of tourists. Majority, of course, are Japanese, and they come from all over Japan to visit and see that particular Buddha. A lot of school children go there as well, because Buddha to the Japanese is very much like Buddha is to the Chinese. It's a rather huge Buddha, and one of the biggest in the world. And as I said a moment ago, it is made of copper and bronze melted down from coins that the Japanese pirates brought back from China. There you see a tourist inspecting one of the urns, and it's in these urns that the Japanese burn joss sticks and that sort of thing to send messages of goodwill to ancestors in heaven. More school children, and the uniform that's worn by those boys is much the same as the uniform worn by schoolboys all over Japan, and the same applies to the girls. This was just a little wishing well at the temple grounds. The tourists went up and they took a cup of water and washed themselves. It was supposed to be very, very pure water. The cherry blossom still, it followed us around practically all over our tour of Japan, and it didn't matter much where you looked once you got away from the inner suburbs of Tokyo as to there was the cherry blossom. This particular scene was taken us a little bit further down in Japan. We were at a place called Hakone, and looking out from the coach window, there was the frigid and very shy Mount Fuji. Fuji to the Japanese is a very, very important place. It's not a religious place, but it's very, very prominent and very, very important in the lives of the Japanese. Once we got down to Hakone and settled ourselves down, we then went on a cable tour, or a cable car, which took us right up to the top of one of the mountains, and looking back down over one of the lakes, which once upon a time was a volcano. And there you can see boats and that sort of thing charging around on the lake many thousands of feet below. There's Hakone there, nestling on the side of the lake. And we would now be many thousands of feet up in the mountains. It was very cold, it was very windy, and I can assure you the 20 minutes that we're up there was quite long enough. Again, looking back down over the lake at Hakone. And this is taken again, as I say, from the mountain top, looking right back over the lakes. Shortly after this particular cable car left, we climbed aboard and headed off down the mountain, and on the way down, I'll see if I can get some more film of Mount Fuji, or Fujiyama, which means a mount, and its name is Fuji. There again is the shy mountain, and as you can see, she is a bit shy today because the cloud is starting to cover it, and I can assure you a lot of people who took photographs of it did not even get a silhouette. We've arrived back down the bottom again beside the lake, and that's just one of the Japanese junks or motorised junks that were touring, taking passengers up and down for tour on the lake. They were very colourful, and they moved along very quickly also. It's just a Japanese hotel nestled on the side of the lake, and I can assure you it'd be a very, very beautiful spot in about another week or two once all the green comes out on all the trees. The boat that you just saw was the one that we were going to go on, and here we are. And we're now doing a sprint now across the lake, and just some of the Japanese houses, Japanese hotels and that sort of thing, guest houses, nestled on the side of the lake. Yes, we're still in Japan, we're not in Holland at all. There you see Alan, Beres and Pat Bryant from Dubbo on the cruiser going about across the lake. It was a cold, blustery day, and I can assure you it was very, very cold up on the mountaintop where we had been some hour before. There you see, we're just one of the little fishing boats on the lake and a torii in the background. The Japanese fishing boats and Japanese boats are passed under those tories and blessed each time of the year, much the same as our fishing boats in Australia. That particular item, don't ask me what it is, but it was at a gallery of some sort, and it just sort of caught my eye, and it just gives you a little bit of an idea of the modern way the Japanese are thinking. This particular scene was taken from our bedroom window at Hakone, and the lake is not very far away, it's just down the track a bit. This is just some of the gardens around the hotel at Hakone. We then went from Hakone down to Hakone railway station, where we were to take a bullet train from there to Kyoto. We took 3 bullet trains altogether. Bullet trains in Japan are like electric trains in Sydney. I understood there was only the 1 or 2, but I can assure you there are many, many bullet trains travelling and all over Japan, and they are being used by different companies. The bullet trains came through at a pretty rapid rate. That's those that didn't stop, I mean. And in a moment you will see one of the bullet trains come charging through. This particular train came in and stopped, and I was ready waiting for this one when he came through. And there goes a bullet train. That happened to be a through train. Very shortly afterwards we climbed aboard one of the bullet trains ourselves and then headed off towards Kyoto. And as you can see there, we are cruising at around about 200 kilometres per hour on our way down to Kyoto. Kyoto is a very beautiful city, and there are many, many Buddhist shrines and many other types of shrines and many castles and that to be seen in and around Kyoto. The Buddhist shrines and the Buddhist temples are very beautiful, they're very colourful, and there's a lot of imaginative work goes in underneath the gables and in and around the temples themselves. They are visited by a lot of people, tourists from Australia, overseas and that sort of thing, and a lot of the Japanese go there. As you can see, there's a lot of regality, a lot of gold, and a lot of gold and bright red colours to the temples and shrines. Around the temples and shrines are some very, very beautiful gardens, and again, cherry blossom. And the cherry blossom was just starting to fall, and as you can see, it's fallen all over the ground. Now, it's not snow. The gardens were very beautiful with pines, cherry blossoms, bonsai trees, and all that kind of thing. There you see some of the tourists, and Beres there taking some photographs of just some of the beauty in the gardens of the Buddhist temple at Kyoto. Just some Japanese girls, they were walking around, and I zoomed up on them. They weren't aware of it, and that's just their national dress. Just another scene of the gardens again at the Buddhist temple at Kyoto. In and around the Buddhist temple at Kyoto were all the beautiful gardens. There you see all the cherry blossoms and the bushes and that sort of thing. Looking out over Kyoto, you'll notice there the word Bell. It was a department store. This was taken from high up on a hill at another shrine or another temple at Kyoto. Kyoto is a very beautiful city. It's well laid out. The streets are all east-west, north-south. and they tell me, providing you keep the mountains in view, they can only be seen down a south-looking street. A silhouette of the shrine high up on the hill at Kyoto. And just looking back through the gates of the entrance to the shrine to a tree, I just thought it was a particularly good shot and worth taking. We then went to Niger Castle, and it was built in 1603 by one of the early emperors of Japan. Kyoto used to be the capital city of Japan, and it's only in the last 100 years that the capital has been moved from Kyoto to Tokyo. And if you take note of the two words, Kyoto and Tokyo, they both use the same letters. And there you see one of the early castles of Japan. And that particular one, as I say a moment ago, was built in 1603. You can wander around, but you must not take any film inside. We then went to the Gold Pavilion, and the Gold Pavilion is featured on majority of Japanese calendars and many other artefacts of Japan, because it is a very, very beautiful little shrine or a beautiful little pavilion set in a beautiful little surrounding, and it is truly a beautiful scene. The gardens around were very beautiful, with many trees and lawns and bushes and shrubs and that style of thing. And it's well worth a visit if you go to Japan. This is just some of the scenery in and around the Gold Pavilion. We then went to another castle in Kyoto, and this is one of the castles belonging to one of the sons of one of the emperors in Japan's history. Again, you were not allowed inside with cameras. All the while you were wandering around, you were being watched by fairly officious-looking gentlemen. They weren't in uniform, but I can assure you they were there all the time. This is still just wandering around the palace grounds. It's beautifully laid out. The Japanese don't use any paint. They just use nature itself. The Buddhist Temple, sure, they use a lot of colour, but the Japanese themselves use nature. And there you see another little arched bridge, and it is also featured on a lot of the calendars and that sort of thing from Japan. Again, no paint, just natural stone, natural trees and so on. More cherry blossom. We couldn't have been in Kyoto probably at a better time, which was April in 1981. There was cherry blossom to be seen just about everywhere. We then went from Kyoto to Hiroshima again by bullet train, and at the moment we're right up high on a hill looking out over Hiroshima. The last time I was in Hiroshima, majority of Hiroshima was rubble. There were just a few new buildings that had just been built, a few new department stores. There was nothing like this whatsoever. There was miles and miles of just rubble. After we'd had a look out over Hiroshima, the new Hiroshima that is, we then went down to the Peace Memorial Park and had a good look around there. We went through the museum and had a look at all the artefacts and that sort of thing. And in this particular area here, some 28, 29 years ago, I wandered around and it was all rubble, because the actual atom bomb was detonated only just a few hundred yards from here. The building you see in the background, I've wandered all around that in the years gone by when it was all rubble, and it was the only remaining building near the centre of the bomb when it was dropped. And it has now been turned into a Peace Memorial Park. The idea of it being that it warns people of the devastation and that sort of thing from atom bombs. And it is being remembered by Japanese families for the loss of some of their members of their families many, many years ago. There's the building a little bit closer again. And as I said a moment ago, I used to wander in and around all through that building when it was still littered with rubble everywhere. Just another scene taken at the Peace Memorial Park, and it happens to be the fountain at the Peace Memorial Park. The Toyota hasn't got anything to do with it whatsoever. We then went down to Miyajima, which is only about 20 miles south of Hiroshima, and we went by boat from the mainland across to Miyajima Island. The torii you see there is where the fishing boats are taken under at high tide, of course, and they are blessed at a certain time of the year, much the same as our own fishing boats are here in Australia. Once we arrived at Miyajima, we then went for a quick look around at some of the temples, shrines and the torii. The torii is also featured in a lot of calendars and also Japan's stamps. There you see Beres again, and just looking back over at the torii. When I saw it in many years ago, the tide was right in, and it would be around about 10 feet deep at that particular place. Just another scene taken from a temple looking back through the torii and the Japanese mainland in the background. Unfortunately, another hazy day. Just another scene taken at Miyajima of the pagodas and part of a temple in the foreground. It's truly a beautiful island. There are many deer on the island just wandering around. Nobody has ever been born on this island, or nobody has ever died on this particular island. They make sure they get rid of all the pregnant mums and that sort of thing well beforehand, just in case. It's a very religious island and very well preserved. We then went down to Iwakuni, where the ex-RAAF base was. It was a nostalgic trip for me. I particularly wanted to take Beres there. We arrived just on dark, and this is a picture of the Kintai Bridge, which is only about 3 miles from the old RAAF base that I was at some 28, 29 years ago. Beres was particularly pleased to see it because she'd seen so many photographs that I'd brought back, and she particularly wanted to see it. And, as I say, it was a very nostalgic little part of our tour of Japan to be able to break away from the tour group and go down only that extra 20 or 30 miles to take some pictures of this particular place, which was taken, as incidentally, just on dark. From Miyajima, we then went on a tour of some of the islands on the inland sea. And when we arrived at one of the islands, we just happened to see there one of the Japanese brides. The tree that you see there is a single tree, and it's propped up by stumps and pieces of stone and that sort of thing. It's a prostrate tree. On one of the islands again, we came across a temple that was built by one of the millionaires. It was just part of his duty to build this. He felt to repay for some of the millions that he'd made from the Japanese people. A rotary sign on one of the islands in the inland sea. We now board the bullet train at Hiroshima and head for Osaka. And just pulling out of Hiroshima is a very famous castle, which is also featured on a lot of the calendars. Unfortunately, we couldn't stop to have a look at it. As I say, this was taken from the bullet train just after it moved out. We're on our way now to Osaka, and in the background you can see the typical Japanese scenery as it flashes by at around about probably 200 kilometres an hour. Very beautiful, I can assure you. And there's Mrs. Bryant's feet. I don't know how that got there, but there they are. And it's about this stage where we're on our way back to Osaka, and we have to say goodbye to Japan, because very shortly afterwards we took off and flew to Taiwan.